to VPG's Virtual Water Cooler Chat podcast, a platform that celebrates the rich tapestry of professional diversity, with a particular emphasis on empowering women. We aim to foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, DEIA, for all, while recognizing and championing the achievements of everyone as a central pillar of our journey. In our conversations, we explore a wide spectrum of backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives, creating a vibrant mosaic that enriches our collective understanding and strengthens our commitment to diversity and empowerment. Timothy M. Hsieh is a founding partner of MH2 Technology Law Group LLP, a law firm focused on helping companies protect their innovations with U.S. and foreign patents. During his 25 years as a patent attorney, he has acquired hundreds of patents for companies ranging from Fortune 500 to startups, as well as universities and other nonprofit organizations. He began his legal career as an associate at the Finnegan firm and clerked for former Chief Judge Rader at the Court of Appeal for the Federal Circuit. Tim obtained his J.D. from the University of Virginia School of Law and holds a Bachelor's, Master's, and Ph.D. degrees from the Johns Hopkins University in Materials Science and Engineering. Prior to law school, Tim spent time at the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, as a co-op student, worked as a materials scientist at several startup companies, and conducted research and development for ground combat vehicles for FMC Defense Systems. When not working on clients' patenting issues, Tim can be found on the golf course, hiking with family, or working as a volunteer ski patroller.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for joining us on the podcast today. This is really exciting. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
So for people, I don't think anyone's going to really know, but Tim has been my mentor for years now, from my early days of college. We can start off with talking about how you know Ashley, and we can touch on how you put me in touch with Ashley in the first place and got me started with VPG.
Sure. So I first met Ashley when I was an associate at Finnegan Henderson. I was assigned a patent litigation, and Ashley was assigned to work with me. And so that's where I met her. I think I was the first case that she worked on as a legal assistant when she got there. Been at this firm, I've stayed in touch with Ashley, and Ashley has, she spent, I think it was 16 years at Finnegan and then left, started her own company, and we've stayed in touch ever since. And after you expressed interest in patent law, I kind of thought that would be a natural fit.
Yeah, it's been history ever since. So you were also at the DEIA workshop recently. You're one of the sponsors. How did that go?
That was really interesting. I mean, I think that's the first DEIA event I've ever been to. The speakers were amazing. Ashley did a great job of organizing.
So we can jump into your story. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you found out about patent law, maybe how you got into engineering in the first place and your eventual transition, just early times?
Yeah, so, it took me a long, long time to discover patent law. I mean, I think, my parents immigrated from China in the 1950s. And so their top priority was education. And so growing up, I pretty much figured my options were science, engineering, or medicine. Law wasn't even on my radar. And so, I think going to Hopkins, I wanted to go to Hopkins because my father and grandfather both went there, both got their PhDs at Hopkins. And so I was there, and I actually didn't know what I wanted to do when I was an undergraduate. I mean, I think I mentioned this to you before. My freshman roommate knew he wanted to be a doctor. Lots of my classmates at Hopkins knew they wanted to be doctors. And I was always a little bit envious of them because I had no idea what I wanted to do. I ended up in engineering. And then after I got my undergraduate degree, I just kind of took the next natural step was to get a master's. And the next natural step after that was to get a PhD. And so again, I really didn't have any exposure to law at Hopkins. And even as a graduate student doing research, I recall my professor saying, yeah, you probably don't want to apply for a patent, you should publish. And so we were really focused on publishing rather than filing for patents.
And then eventually, how did you discover patent law from there?
Yeah, and so I think, one of the important factors was when I was in graduate school, this was before the Federal Circuit was around. And so patents weren't really of that much value. I mean, People would apply for them, but there weren't a lot of patent infringement lawsuits. And after I started working as an engineer, I was a co-op student at NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. And then I worked for a small startup company. After I got married, my wife and I moved to California. And I worked for a defense contractor. Back then it was called FMC Ground Systems. And we made the Bradley fighting vehicle. It's an armored personnel carrier for the Army. And so working there, I was working on various aspects of this armored personnel carrier. And I had the opportunity to work with their in-house counsel, working on a couple of different patent applications, and then also working on a patent litigation that FMC was being sued by another company. And the more I worked with him, I think the more I realized that his job was way more fun than mine. When you work on a big project like a ground vehicle for the Army, you're working on one little tiny aspect of that ground vehicle. And so I didn't have a good overview of the entire vehicle or what anyone else was doing. I was just focused on my tiny little piece of that vehicle. And I think the other factor was that most of the work I was doing was classified. So I was working in a SCIF. And so in a SCIF, you're not allowed to have any cell phones. Actually, back then, there weren't any cell phones. But, there's no outside communication. There are no windows. And then, in the evenings when I came home from work, I couldn't talk to my wife about what I did. And then my wife had an opportunity to move from California to Boston for her job. And we decided to move. I left FMC, but was still consulting for them. And so that really gave me the opportunity to look into law as a career. As a consultant for FMC, I wasn't really working full-time. And so I reached out to a couple of different people to inquire about patent law because while I had an interest in it, I really didn't know anything about it. And so there were a couple of people that I remember that were kind of instrumental in putting me on the right track. One was a patent litigator. Her name was Susan Glovsky. We met on an airplane. She was sitting next to me on a flight, I think to Colorado. We were going skiing. And, she happened to mention that she was a patent litigator. And we chatted the entire way about what her job was and how interesting it was. And that it motivated me to reach out to, other people. There was a professor at Boston University at that time. I think his name was Robert Murgis. And I think he's since left and gone to Berkeley, but he was gracious enough to meet with me. And he talked about patent law, the different types of jobs that you could do as a patent attorney. And so, yeah, that was really my introduction to patent law.
So it sounds like the people you spoke to, there was a lot of patent litigators. So what made you decide to go towards prosecution instead of litigation?
Yeah, so when I started my law career after law school, I went to a big firm called Finnegan Henderson, and that was great because they do prosecution, they do licensing, they do litigation, and so I started off doing just prosecution, which was a lot of fun. And then as you get more senior, they kind of move you towards litigation, which again was really enjoyable. One factor that kind of moved me towards prosecution is I was on this one big litigation when I was there. I was probably a fourth year associate, and there were, a dozen patents involved on both sides, probably 15 attorneys at Finnegan versus, the other company probably had, 15, 20 attorneys. And I felt like I missed my daughter's entire 6-year-old existence because I was flying back and forth around the world doing depositions. And I think we're probably doing this litigation for 9 months or so. And so, yeah, I really missed a lot of my daughter's life at that point. And then the other factor was I left Finnegan Henderson and did a clerkship for Judge Rader at the CAFC. And when I returned to Finnegan after that, of course, they wanted me to do more and more litigation, which again was really enjoyable, but it was not only time consuming, but your schedule really wasn't your own, right? If the judge needed something Christmas Eve, you have to deliver. So that was kind of the other factor pushing me towards doing more prosecution.
What sparked your decision to go clerk and then return? Take it you're doing that.
Yeah, so I met Judge Rader when I was at the University of Virginia Law School, and he was teaching the patent law class. And he is one of the most energetic, enthusiastic people I've ever met. Not only that, but really knowledgeable about patent law. And I think, meeting him and taking his class really validated my decision to go back to law school and be a patent attorney. But I've been working for a while, and then he called and said, I have kind of a gap between two clerks, and I have, 4 or 5 months that I need a clerk would you be interested? And of course, I jumped at the opportunity and spent a really fun 6 months, maybe it was 4 months, clerking for Judge Rader.
Can you talk about what skills you gained from clerking and how you felt it helped you return to work and be a better patent attorney once you got back to Finnegan?
So it's interesting because, when you're a patent litigator, you see one side, but when you're clerking for the judge, you really get an interesting peek behind the curtain. And so working for Judge Rader was really a lot of fun. I think that's probably the most fun I've had as a patent attorney because you and your co-clerk spend all day discussing cases, discussing nuances about patent law. And so, yeah, I think that was really valuable, at least for me when I do prosecution, because now when I'm drafting claims or drafting the specification of a patent, I really know what not only patent litigators are looking for, but what judges are looking for when they're in the middle of a patent case.
So I want to go back a little bit, back in time from where we were. How were your parents, how did they react to your decision when you said, oh, I want to go pursue law? Because I also come from an immigrant family. I totally get that pressure. Oh, you got to be a doctor or you got to do something like that. I went into Hopkins pre-med and then it was a journey from there. But how did they react to that?
So, my parents have always been super supportive. And I think when I decided to go back to law school, it was certainly a kind of a big shock because I'd already, gotten my PhD in engineering. I'd worked for 5 years as an engineer. And so, it was not only my parents, but I think it was also my classmates in grad school, as well as my professor. They were all fairly shocked that I would change careers, kind of mid-track and make such a huge turn. I mean, they thought it was a huge turn, but my parents were very supportive. I mean, I think the other person I'm really thankful for is my wife because, my daughter was born 3 months before law school started. We were living in Boston at the time. And so we had to move from Boston to Charlottesville for law school with, basically a newborn. My wife's job was still in Boston. So she commuted to Boston from Charlottesville every other week. And so, yeah, it was a huge commitment and a huge sacrifice on her part. I think at least my wife understood, where I was coming from because she had seen, I guess, how frustrated I was working as an engineer and not being able to discuss my job with her. But I think my parents and my professors were a little bit more shocked because it was they thought I was taking kind of an off ramp to do something completely different and something they really didn't understand.
Yeah, I totally get that. Especially I feel like back then patent law wasn't as prevalent of a field, not as many people knew about it and
Yeah.
how it requires a background like that. So do you feel like your background, your extensive background in engineering was as helpful in your work in litigation as it obviously is in prosecution?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think having an engineering background in litigation is helpful, but I think at least most of the work I was doing was more directed towards, legal issues, patent law, rather than the technology. I mean, I think there are, certain skills that a litigator needs to have. And one of them, I think maybe the most important one is being able to explain to a judge or jury what the technology is, in layman's terms, and being able to explain what the differences are in, the invention versus a prior art and versus what an infringer's product is doing. And so, yes, while I think having an engineering degree is important for patent litigation, I think your communication skills are way more valuable.
How did you practice that? I mean, coming from a background where I feel like when you're an engineer, you don't need to do that at all. Everyone around you will understand every long esoteric word that you're using for the technology. So how did you practice communicating that in layman's terms?
I mean, I don't think we consciously practice that. I mean, I think going to a firm like Finnegan Henderson was a huge boost to my career. They have experts in virtually every aspect of patent law, and they do a really nice job of, bringing you along because I think I've explained to you, not much of what you learn in law school is really going to help you as a patent attorney, right? You really learn it once you start your job. And being at a firm like Finnegan Henderson, they gave you lots of opportunities to speak, lots of opportunities to do case reviews. And that's really where you develop those skills, working with partners, with your other associates. That's, really the only way to develop those skills, unless you naturally have them, and some people do.
On that note, for people like me in law school, do you have any advice on extracurriculars or summer positions that you would recommend to gain that kind of exposure more earlier on? For example, even if a law student wants to go into prosecution, do you still recommend working in litigation for a little bit or clerking, something like that?
Yeah, so I think the best piece of advice that I've gotten is to start your career at a big law firm.
Mm.
Because at a big law firm, one advantage is they have lots of different clients. And so you get to work on, Fortune 500 companies, you get to work with small startups. The other advantage is they will have lots of different types of work, right? And so you can experience patent prosecution, you can try out licensing, you can do litigation, and that way you get kind of a broader view of the entire landscape of what patent law is. And that way, you'll be in a better position to decide what you want to do. And I think the last advantage of going to a big firm like Finnegan Henderson is you'll meet other associates there, other partners there who will become your network, as you progress in your career. I mean, I can't think of the number of former Finnegan associates that I've known that are now, they're at big companies or at different law firms. And so they become your network as you progress through your patent law career.
Or starting a
Or starting.
paralegal consultancy like Virtual Patent Gateway.
Yeah. The other important piece of advice I got was from a partner at Finnegan Henderson, and he said, your admin is going to be your biggest supporter at the law firm. That's stuck with me ever since.
Wow. Let's also transition into starting your own firm. I want to talk a lot about that. Let's start with what made you decide to break away and start MH2.
Yeah, so after I finished my clerkship with Judge Rader, I went back to Finnegan Henderson. And of course, after you do a clerkship, they want you to do more and more litigation. And so I was doing primarily litigation when I went back. And two of my friends at the firm, John Hack and Don Min, they had been talking about starting a law firm to focus on prosecution. And I happened to overhear their conversation one day, and I said, "Yeah, that's an interesting idea." And I remembered how much more difficult it was to schedule your life when you do litigation compared to prosecution. And so, by that time, my son was born, and so I had two kids, two young kids, and I thought I'd take a chance and start a firm with these two colleagues of mine to focus on just on patent prosecution. And I thought the advantages would be I'd be able to go to my kids' recitals, I'd be able to go to my kids' sports games while maintaining a career in patent law.
And can you tell me how the process was in starting a law firm? It must be quite substantial, getting clients and
Yeah, I
establishing.
mean, it was definitely a stressful process. I remember Don Min, he's the M in MH2. He left probably a month before John and I did, and he laid all the groundwork. And I mean, he got the malpractice insurance. He did everything that you need to start a law firm. And one of the biggest decisions, or the most important decision I remember we made, is we talked about clients, and we decided not to take any clients from Finnegan Henderson. And I think that was very unique. A lot of attorneys leave a law firm and take a client with them, so they have work to do that first day. And we actually left and had nothing to do that first day because we didn't take any clients. And so our first 3 months were spent just doing client development.
Why did you decide not to take any clients?
For a couple of reasons. I mean, I think, one, Finnegan Henderson is one of the largest, most important intellectual property firms in the world. We certainly didn't want to piss them off. And I think the second reason was I think it was more of a pride issue. We wanted to be able to start from scratch and pick and choose kind of the clients we wanted to work with. One of the other things we decided is that unlike most law firms, we didn't want to charge it by the hour. When you're at a big firm, you keep track of every 6 minutes of your life. We thought it'd be easier just to do everything on a fixed fee basis. And so we were really looking for clients who would send us bulk work and be, kind of agreeable to do fixed fee work.
How do you develop a client base? Is it just cold calling?
Yes. And, there are two ways. I remember one of our earliest clients was Xerox, and that was a cold call. We got the name of their chief patent counsel. We called and we said, we just started a law firm. We focus on patent prosecution. Would you mind, meeting with us and allowing us to tell you about ourselves? And they were agreeable, and they started sending us work, and they've been a client ever since, which is terrific. The other interesting one was Texas Instruments. Don Min happened to see an article in a law journal about a Texas Instruments attorney getting an award. And he cold called her and said, hey, we started a firm that focuses on patent law. Would you be interested in hearing about us? And she was gracious enough to say, I have nothing to do with patent law, but I can put you in touch with the right people. And so she arranged a lunch for us with their chief patent counsel. And so that's how we were able to get our foot in the door for Texas Instruments. And then other clients came because there were other former Finnegan attorneys who had left and gone in-house. Again, we contacted them and they were gracious enough to send us, work and try us out. So yeah, there's a lot of luck involved, but there's also a lot of connecting with former colleagues at your former firms.
Do you still stay in touch with anyone from law school?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably different now, but when I was at UVA, there were probably, maybe half dozen or 8 of us that knew we wanted to be patent attorneys. And so we all kind of knew each other and hung out a little bit. So yeah, I still keep in touch with them.
No, I don't think it's that different anymore. At least in my experience, the people who know they want to do patent law are kind of few. There's a few people I've talked to where they're like, well, I was engineering in undergrad, so everyone tells me I should do patent law, so I don't know, I'm thinking about it. But few people that know, I think majority are more in your boat, where they've gone and worked as an engineer for a long time and then they go to law school with the purpose of pursuing patent law, but it's few people.
Is there a patent law group?
So there's the Intellectual Property Law Association.
Okay.
And that's pretty much as specific as it gets in terms of student groups. And there's a few students pursuing patent law within that. But I only know like 4 or 5, especially for prosecution.
Right.
I think patent litigation, we can find a lot more.
It's interesting because I know in the DC area, at least, UVA there weren't that many students interested in patent law because it's still, an hour and a half, 2 hours from DC. A lot of the attorneys that I met when I started working knew they wanted to be patent attorneys, but they worked part-time or went to school part-time. And so in DC, you can do that. You can go to school full-time and work part-time, or work full-time and go to school part-time. And there were a lot of people who did that.
Yeah, I also think that's common specifically in patent law because people start out as engineers and then decide they want to go to law school. So they continue to work as they do school part-time. And I go to UCLA, so a little ways away from DC. I think the location pulls a certain audience of law students. Like there's a lot of entertainment in LA, a lot of entertainment law.
Yeah, that makes sense.
DC is the place to be for patent law. Were there any specific moments or stories in your journey of starting your law firm that was kind of a moment of, oh, this is taking off? Like you felt like, oh, we've hit the ground now.
Yeah, I mean, certainly getting your first client, was an important milestone. Getting your first big client, especially when, because we started with, nothing. And so we were starting from no clients. And so, yeah, that was a huge milestone getting our first client. I think the other kind of big milestone was getting office space. When we first started, I was in the DC area. Don, who was also in the DC area, decided to move to California because we had thought, San Francisco with Silicon Valley there, that would be a source of lots of our clients. And so he moved out there. And John Hack, he decided to move back to Gainesville, Florida, because he wanted to finish his Ph.D. while starting this law firm. And so we were really a virtual law firm at that point. And I think probably 2 years after we had started, we had enough clients where we needed to hire a patent secretary. We wanted to hire some associates. And at that point, we needed, space. And so, yeah, getting that first office was a big milestone.
And that was, you got an office space in DC or where?
So no, we tried to avoid DC because of the traffic. And so we got our first office space in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, which was great for a few years. But, now the traffic is just as bad going to Tyson's as it is to DC. So that's not really an advantage anymore.
It's not going to get any better.
No, and I think most of us are still working virtually. So that was, kind of the only nice bonus of COVID, right? I mean, the attorneys and the admin realized that they could work efficiently from home. And so now all of us save 20 minutes to an hour commuting every day.
Do you prefer working at home, or do you see any specific situations where going into the office is a benefit? Like, do you call everyone in if there's a specific type of meeting happening?
Typically, no. I mean, we try to have events every month, so just so we get a chance to see each other in person. One of the drawbacks, I think, of working at home is, especially for the younger attorneys, they don't get to work in person with the more senior people and watch and learn from them. I think doing patent prosecution is you don't have a lot of meetings, and you tend to work by yourself or in small groups a lot. And so working remotely isn't a big deal for the more senior attorneys. But yeah, I think it's a disadvantage for the younger attorneys because they don't get to see and work with other people on a daily basis.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think for the younger generation, at least for me, being at home during COVID, made it very hard to separate work and home life. I think if you haven't had that balance established already before COVID started, it blurred the lines a lot. And for me, it was school, but it was kind of the same thing where I was just at my desk the whole day in my bedroom. So let's talk a little bit more about the field of patent law in general. For some context, I wanted to give some backstory on how you came to Hopkins. How long ago at this point? I think it was
started in 1979 as a freshman, and then I left in 89 after I got my PhD.
And we've been very involved in the alumni network. So, I mean, you came back, I think, a year ago to give a talk about AI and the influence that all these technological advancements are going to have in patent law. So, AI, or among other, I know that's buzzword right now, but among all of the advancements happening, what challenges in the field of patent law are you looking forward to tackling in the future?
I think for me, the most interesting thing is the technology, not really the changes in patent law, because judges and Congress decides that, and you just have to kind of deal with whatever changes they make. But yeah, the really cool thing is the technology. I mean, back when I started, it was, the internet and software was kind of the cool thing. And then after that, it was biotech. Right. And then after that, there was nanotechnology was huge, right? Everyone was, no, nanotech is going to change the world. And now with AI and I think quantum computing. So yeah, for me, it's really the change in technology that's really cool. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, with things like CRISPR and everything is going at an exponential speed. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I think that's, now that you mentioned, I think that's the other aspect about prosecution I like. I mean, when you're doing litigation, right, it's really backwards looking technology, right? It's a patent that's already been issued and you're arguing over that. But with prosecution, you're really working on, cutting edge technology. You're talking with the world's leading expert on that, one invention. And so that's what's really exciting for me.
And we'll end on a very fitting question related to what we're just talking about. So throughout your career, you've seen some fascinating inventions, I'm sure. Do you have a favorite one that particularly impressed or surprised you?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I would say the patent applications that I enjoyed working on the most was one from Johns Hopkins, and it was a team of doctors who invented a system for face transplants. There were a lot of jokes about that, the Face Off movie with Nicolas Cage. But so, yeah, what was cool about this invention is that it had to do with surgery, it had to do with robotics, it had to do with 3D printing, it had to do with software. It had to do with, sensors and lasers and optics. And so it was really kind of a fascinating invention. And because it was so multidisciplinary, we had a couple of different attorneys with different technical backgrounds working on it together. And so that was really, really very cool. One mistake we made with that is we scheduled a lunch meeting to talk about the disclosure that we got sent. And there were videos and pictures. And we were eating lunch and looking at these videos of them doing a proof of concept surgery on transplanting the face of one pig onto another pig. And just that kind of ruined lunch for us.
Bad timing. All right, that's going to be our wrap up for the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your journey. We appreciate your time, your insights, and also thank you to Ashley and Virtual Patent Gateway for not only introducing us, but bringing you onto this podcast that we can have this discussion. Before we sign off, do you want to let the listeners know where they can connect with you, connect with MH2?
Yeah, they can feel free to email me at tim@mh2law.com. Happy to chat with anybody.
Awesome.
And thanks,
Thank-
Kiana, for organizing and moderating this.